Captain Klaus Hoffmann gripped the tank commander's periscope with both hands, his knuckles white against the cold metal. October 1944, northern Italy. The narrow streets of what used to be a peaceful village now lay in ruins reduced to rubble and memories by months of grinding warfare. His Panther tank, 45 tons of German engineering excellence, rolled forward with the confidence of a predator that had never met its equal. Hoffmann had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. He knew what to look for. He had developed the instincts that separated the living from the dead in armored warfare. American GIs with their bazookas. You saw them coming from 200 meters away. That brilliant white smoke trail streaking across the battlefield like a firework pointing directly back to the shooter's position, like an arrow saying, "I am here. Kill me." British anti-tank guns. Even worse. The muzzle flash lit up their position like a lighthouse, giving you 3 full seconds to swing your turret and unleash hell with the MG-42. These visual cues were his lifeline. They told him where to aim, where to suppress, where to kill. In armored combat, the first person to spot the enemy usually wins. And Hoffmann was very, very good at spotting enemies. But then came the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Thud, not an explosion, not a whoosh of rocket propulsion, just a dull metallic impact like someone had struck the side of his tank with a giant hammer. The sound was so underwhelming, so ordinary, that for a split second Hoffmann thought perhaps they had merely struck some debris in the road. Then came the screech, the catastrophic, reality-shattering screech of molten metal tearing through armor plate. The shaped charge warhead had punched through the Panther's side armor as if it were paper, sending a jet of superheated copper plasma into the crew compartment at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees. The last thing Hoffmann saw before the flames engulfed his vision was the face of his gunner, a 20-year-old kid from Bavaria, turning toward him with an expression of complete bewilderment. Not fear, not pain, just confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand what was happening to him. Then fire, then darkness, then screaming. Hoffmann woke up 3 days later in an Allied prisoner of war hospital. Third-degree burns across 40% of his body. His crew, all dead. The kid from Bavaria, the loader from Hamburg, the driver who had shown him photographs of his newborn daughter just that morning, all dead. And the question that consumed every waking moment that burned brighter than the pain of his wounds. What in God's name killed us? There had been no flash, no smoke trail, no warning whatsoever. One moment they were advancing with tactical superiority. The next moment, his world was fire and death. Hoffmann demanded answers from his captors. He needed to know. Not for revenge, though that desire certainly burned within him, but simply to understand, to make sense of the senseless. When the American medical officer finally showed him a photograph of the weapon that had destroyed his tank, Hoffmann stared at it for a full minute in absolute silence. Then he laughed, a bitter, disbelieving laugh that hurt his burned throat. "You are joking," he said in heavily accented English. "This is not possible. This looks like plumbing equipment, pipes welded together by a farmer." But the American officer was not joking, and that crude, ugly spring-loaded pipe had just revolutionized infantry anti-tank warfare. Cool warfare in a way that neither side had anticipated. The Germans had a name for it now, Geisterwaffe, the ghost weapon. The weapon that killed without being seen. The weapon that turned confident tank commanders into paranoid, terrified men who flinched at every shadow. And the man who would become the most feared wielder of this ghost weapon, the soldier German intelligence would eventually place a 500 Reichsmark bounty on, was at that very moment sitting in a court-martial hearing in Mississippi facing a dishonorable discharge for the crime of being too smart for his own good. His name was Jack Morrison, and he had absolutely no idea that within 6 months he would become a ghost. Let us go back to where this story truly begins. Before the legend, before the fear, before Jack Morrison learned that sometimes the most devastating weapons are the ones nobody sees coming. March 1944, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the American South during wartime, where thousands of young men were being forged into soldiers whether they wanted to be or not. The air hung thick and humid, carrying the scent of pine trees and red clay dirt. In a small administrative building that had seen better days, Jack Morrison stood at attention before three officers who held his entire future in their hands. 26 years old, 6 feet tall, maybe a bit under, broad shoulders built from years of physical labor, hands scarred and calloused from working with tools and machinery, dark hair cut military short, though it still managed to look slightly disheveled, as if it actively resisted military discipline. Brown eyes that right now showed a mixture of defiance and barely concealed frustration. Morrison was not a natural soldier. Everyone could see that. He slouched slightly, even at attention. He had a habit of questioning orders that seemed inefficient or poorly thought out. He treated military equipment like the machinery it was subject to improvement and optimization, rather than as sacred objects to be used exactly as the manual specified. His crime, unauthorized weapon modification. He had taken it upon himself to redesign the standard issue M1 bazooka, altering the exhaust port configuration to reduce backblast by 40%, while simultaneously improving accuracy by 15% through better weight distribution. His modifications worked beautifully, in fact. The weapon was objectively superior to the factory model. But in the United States Army, works beautifully means nothing if you did not ask permission first. Chain of command exists for a reason. Regulations exist for a reason. And soldiers who think they know better than the generals and engineers who design the weapons are dangerous. Not to the enemy, but to the fundamental structure that holds an army together. The judge advocate, a stern-faced major with ribbons from the First War, read the charges in a flat, emotionless voice. Insubordination, unauthorized modification of military equipment, failure to respect the chain of command. Each charge carried potential penalties. Together, they added up to one inevitable conclusion: dishonorable discharge. Go home in shame. Live the rest of your life explaining to potential employers why the military found you unsuitable. For Jack Morrison, that prospect was almost worse than death. Not because he loved the military, he did not, but because going home a failure, proving his father right, that he was too stubborn and too arrogant for his own good, that thought was unbearable. The major finished reading the charges, set down the papers, looked at Morrison with an expression that might have been disappointment or might have been something else entirely. "Corporal Morrison, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Morrison's jaw clenched. He wanted to explain, wanted to defend his actions, wanted to point out that his modifications could save lives, could make American soldiers more effective, could give them an edge in combat that might mean the difference between coming home or dying in some foreign field. But he had already tried explaining, multiple times, to multiple officers, and they had all given him the same response: "We do not care if it works better. You do not have the authority to make those decisions." So instead, Morrison said the only thing that seemed honest: "No, sir. No defense. I saw a problem. I fixed it. That is what I do. That is what I have always done." The major nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. The other two officers exchanged glances. One of them, a Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had never seen before, leaned forward slightly. "Corporal, are you familiar with the principle of specialization of labor?" Morrison blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Sir, at the Ford plant where you worked before enlisting, did you design the entire automobile? Or did you work on a specific component?" "A specific component, sir. Engine assembly." "And did you ever take it upon yourself to redesign other parts of the vehicle? The transmission, perhaps, or the brake system?" "No, sir. That was not my responsibility." "Why not?" Morrison hesitated. He could see where this was going, but could not quite figure out the angle. "Because other people were responsible for those systems, sir. People who understood them better than I did." "Precisely. Specialization. You were an expert in engines, not in transmissions, not in brakes. You understood your role and stayed within it." The lieutenant colonel sat back, letting that sink in. "The Army works the same way, Corporal. We have engineers who design weapons, tacticians who develop doctrine, soldiers who implement those doctrines using those weapons. When you modify a weapon without authorization, you are not simply improving a tool. You are disrupting a system. You are claiming expertise you have not been granted." Morrison felt his frustration rising. "With respect, sir, I do have expertise. I understand mechanical systems. I understand force distribution and energy transfer and structural integrity. That bazooka modification was not guesswork. It was applied engineering. Applied engineering without proper authorization, oversight, or testing protocols. The major interjected. What if your modification had failed in combat? What if the reduced backblast had been achieved by weakening critical structural elements and the weapon had exploded in a soldier's hands? Who would be responsible then? Morrison had no answer to that, because the truth was he had not considered that possibility. He had tested the modification himself repeatedly, and it had worked every time. But proper engineering protocols existed for a reason. Redundant testing, peer review, failure analysis. He had bypassed all of that in his arrogance. The room fell silent. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat, feel sweat beginning to form on his back despite the relatively cool temperature. This was it, the end of his military career, possibly the end of any career. Who wants to hire a mechanic too stubborn to follow directions? Then the door opened. A British officer stepped into the room and everything changed. Major Lloyd Blackwood wore the uniform of the British Army with the casual elegance that seemed to come naturally to British officers. 40 years old, perhaps. Thin face, sharp eyes that missed nothing. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how much authority he wielded. "Gentlemen," he said, his accent crisp and proper, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe this court-martial may be premature." The judge advocate looked annoyed. "Major Blackwood, this is a closed proceeding. I am also aware that Corporal Morrison possesses a rather unique skill set that may be of considerable value to Allied operations." Blackwood set his portfolio on the table, opened it, extracted several photographs. "Gentlemen, may I present the PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, British design currently in use by Canadian forces with remarkable effectiveness." He spread the photographs across the table. Each one showed destroyed German tanks, Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, massive armored vehicles that were supposed to be nearly indestructible, now reduced to burned-out hulks. "Notice anything unusual about these kill shots?" Blackwood asked. The officers leaned forward, studying the images. Morrison, still standing at attention, could not see them clearly, but felt his curiosity piqued despite himself. The lieutenant colonel frowned. "The penetration wounds are clean, very focused, but there is no blast pattern around the impact point. No scorch marks typical of rocket-propelled grenades." "Precisely," Blackwood said, "because the PIAT is not a rocket launcher. It is a spigot mortar, spring-powered, no backblast, no smoke trail, no muzzle flash. It kills tanks while remaining completely invisible to the enemy." Morrison's engineer brain immediately activated. Spring-powered. How much force would be required? What was the mechanism? How did you achieve sufficient velocity for armor penetration without rocket propulsion? Questions flooded his mind, pushing aside his anxiety about the court-martial. This was a puzzle, a mechanical challenge, the kind of problem that had always fascinated him more than anything else in life. Blackwood continued, "The Canadians have been using PIATs with extraordinary success in Italy. German tank crews are terrified of them. Wehrmacht tactical reports specifically mention the weapon. They call it Geisterwaffe, the ghost weapon." He pulled out another document. German military communications translated into English. "Allied forces, particularly Canadian units, are deploying anti-tank weapons of unknown type. Characteristics: no visible launch signature, no smoke trail, no muzzle flash, penetration capability equivalent to Panzerfaust, but at significantly greater range. Tank commanders report complete inability to locate shooters after engagement. Psychological impact on crews assessed as severe. Classification priority, high threat. All armored units exercise extreme caution in areas known to house Canadian infantry." The room had gone very quiet. Even the judge advocate looked impressed, though he was clearly trying not to show it. Blackwood turned to Morrison directly. "Corporal, the American military is skeptical of the PIAT. They believe it is outdated technology, too crude, too primitive compared to the bazooka. But the combat results speak for themselves. We need American observers to evaluate the weapon, learn its tactics, and report back on whether it merits wider adoption." He paused, letting that sink in. "You have demonstrated considerable mechanical aptitude. You understand systems. You think like an engineer. These are precisely the qualities we need for this evaluation program. 6 months attached to the 1st Canadian Infantry Division in Italy. Learn the PIAT, master it, assess its capabilities, provide detailed technical analysis. Morrison's heart was racing now. This was an opportunity, an escape from disgrace. But more than that, it was a chance to work with genuinely interesting technology. "Sir," he said carefully, "what happens to the charges?" Blackwood smiled slightly. "If you volunteer for this program and complete it successfully, your service record will reflect only that you were selected for a specialized weapons evaluation assignment. The court-martial proceedings will be sealed. Your engineering talents will be properly channeled rather than suppressed." The judge advocate did not look happy. "Major Blackwood, this court has jurisdiction over. This court has jurisdiction over American military personnel," Blackwood interrupted smoothly. "Once Corporal Morrison volunteers for assignment to a joint Allied command structure, he falls under my authority as liaison officer. Unless, of course, you would prefer to keep him here facing charges while Canadian forces continue to demonstrate that American skepticism about the PIAT is misplaced." It was a polite threat delivered with British courtesy, but a threat nonetheless. The political implications were clear. If America court-martialed a talented mechanic, while Allied forces were proving American weapons doctrine wrong, it would not look good for anyone involved. The judge advocate sighed, looked at Morrison. "Do you accept this assignment, Corporal?" Morrison thought about his father working the assembly line at Ford, thought about the cramped apartment in Dearborn where he had grown up, thought about the voice in his head that always asked why and how and can this be done better. He thought about crude spring-loaded pipes somehow killing the most advanced tanks in the world. "Yes, sir, I accept." 3 hours later, Morrison sat in a transport truck heading north, everything he owned packed into a single duffel bag. The charges had been dismissed, his record cleared, and within 48 hours he would be on a train to Canada for training with a weapon he had never heard of until this morning. He pulled out the small photograph he always carried. His father standing in front of a Model T Ford, tools in hand, that rare smile on his face that only appeared when he was working on something mechanical. His father had told him once the night before Morrison left for the war, "Son, remember what we built at Ford. Engines that turn regular folks into free people who can go anywhere. That is American ingenuity. Not fancy, not complicated, just smart and reliable." Morrison had not understood then what his father was trying to tell him. But sitting in that truck bouncing along rutted southern roads toward an unknown future, he began to suspect that maybe the lesson was about more than just automobiles. Maybe American ingenuity was not about having the most advanced technology. Maybe it was about taking whatever you had and making it work better than it had any right to work. Maybe that was what the P8 represented. British desperation transformed into Canadian effectiveness through sheer practical determination. And maybe, just maybe, an American mechanic who thought too much and followed orders too little was exactly the right person to understand it. Outside the truck, Mississippi pine forest gave way to night. Morrison did not sleep, could not sleep. His mind was too busy turning over questions about spring mechanisms and force distribution and armor penetration. Somewhere in Germany, Klaus Hoffmann lay in his hospital bed, still trying to understand what had killed his crew. Somewhere in Italy, Canadian soldiers were hunting German tanks with weapons that looked like plumbing equipment and worked like silent thunder. And somewhere between Mississippi and Canada, Jack Morrison was about to become something he had never imagined, a ghost who killed without being seen. An American who would prove that the simplest weapons, wielded with intelligence and courage, could terrorize the most sophisticated enemy. The PIAT was waiting. The war was waiting. And history, though Morrison did not know it yet, was about to remember his name. The ghost was about to be born. Camp Valcartier, Quebec, April 1944. The train arrived from Mississippi to Canada had taken 3 days crossing from the humid American South through the industrial heartland and into the still, frozen landscape of French Canada. Morrison stepped off that train into a different world. Snow still clung to the shadows of buildings, despite the calendar insisting it was spring. The air bit at his lungs with a sharpness he had never experienced in Michigan winters. And the men who met him at the station looked at him with the particular expression soldiers reserve for outsiders who have not yet proven themselves worthy of respect. 12 American soldiers had been selected for this program. Morrison knew none of them. They came from different units, different backgrounds, different parts of the country. What they shared was a combination of mechanical aptitude and a service record that suggested they thought too independently for the comfort of their commanding officers. The Army was sending its misfits to learn from the Canadians. Whether this was punishment or opportunity remained to be seen. The training facility sat on the outskirts of the base, a collection of wooden buildings that looked temporary, but had clearly been there for years. Canadian and American flags hung side by side, though the Canadian flag saw considerably more attention and care. A sergeant stood waiting for them, arms crossed, face showing no expression whatsoever. Sergeant Thomas Mackenzie, 6 feet 2 inches of solid Canadian muscle wrapped in a uniform that had seen actual combat. 35 years old, though his eyes looked older. Ribbon on his chest from Dieppe, that catastrophic raid in 1942, where Canadian forces had been torn apart on French beaches. The men who survived Dieppe came back different, harder, less patient with training exercises and theoretical discussions. Bull Mackenzie, they called him. Not because he was large, though he was, but because once he decided on a direction, he moved forward with absolute determination, crushing anything in his path. "Gentlemen," Mackenzie said, and his voice carried the flat tone of someone who had already decided these Americans would probably disappoint him. "Welcome to PIAT training. I understand you Yanks think this weapon is outdated, primitive, not worthy of your advanced American engineering standards." He paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. "You are correct. It is primitive. It is also the most effective infantry anti-tank weapon currently in use by any army in this war. And over the next 6 weeks, you will learn why the Germans fear it more than your bazookas, your anti-tank guns, and your tactical air support combined." Mackenzie turned and walked toward one of the buildings. The Americans followed, boots crunching on gravel mixed with melting snow. Inside the building was sparse. Wooden benches, a chalkboard covered with technical diagrams, and along one wall, lined up like medieval weapons in an armory, a dozen PIATs. Morrison saw them and felt his first genuine disappointment. They looked even cruder in person than they had in the photographs. Roughly cylindrical tubes, maybe 3 feet long, with a shoulder stock that appeared to be made from stamped metal rather than properly machined parts. The whole assembly looked heavy, ungainly, like someone had welded together components from different machines without bothering to create any aesthetic coherence. "Pick one up," Mackenzie ordered. Morrison approached the nearest PIAT, reached down, grasped it with one hand, tried to lift it. The weapon barely moved. He used both hands, hefted it properly. 35 pounds, he estimated. Maybe more. The weight distribution was terrible all forward, heavy with the shoulder stock providing minimal counterbalance. "Ugly is it not," Mackenzie said, though his tone suggested he was not looking for agreement. "The bazooka is sleek, aerodynamic. Looks like something from a science fiction magazine. This looks like plumbing parts assembled by a drunk welder." He walked over, took a PIAT from the rack with practiced ease. "The bazooka uses a rocket motor, sophisticated propulsion system, electrical firing mechanism. When it works, it is quite impressive. When the electrical system fails, or the rocket motor misfires, or any of a dozen other complex components malfunction, it becomes an expensive metal tube." Mackenzie set the PIAT down on a bench with a heavy thud. "The PIAT uses a spring, a very large, very powerful spring. No electronics, no rocket fuel, no complex propulsion system, just mechanical energy stored in steel. Physics that has been understood since the ancient Greeks invented the catapult. It cannot misfire because there is nothing to misfire. It cannot fail because there is nothing complex enough to fail." He looked at each of the Americans in turn. "But that simplicity comes with a what? The spring requires enormous force to cock. The recoil is punishing. The weapon will injure you if you use it incorrectly. And it requires genuine physical strength and courage to operate effectively in combat. The question is whether you soft American boys have what it takes." Morrison felt the challenge in those words, felt the assumption underneath them that Americans were somehow less capable, less tough than Canadians who had been fighting this war longer and harder. His stubborn streak kicked in immediately, the same stubborn streak that had gotten him court-martialed. "Sir, request permission to attempt cocking the weapon." Mackenzie's expression did not change. "Permission granted." Morrison studied the PIAT's mechanism. The principles were clear enough once you examined it closely. The large spring inside the tube was held compressed by a trigger mechanism. When you pulled the trigger, it released the spring, which drove a heavy steel rod called a spigot forward with tremendous force. This spigot struck the tail of the bomb, detonating a propellant cartridge that launched the projectile while simultaneously driving the spigot backward to recompress the spring and cock the weapon for the next shot. Simple, elegant even in its mechanical purity. But that initial cocking before the first shot required manually compressing that massive spring, and the instructions written on a card attached to the weapon indicated the proper method. Stand the PIAT on its butt plate, grasp the cocking handle with both hands, pull upward with full body weight. Morrison positioned himself, gripped the handle, pulled. The spring moved perhaps a quarter inch, then stopped. Morrison repositioned his feet, got better, leverage, pulled harder. The spring compressed another half inch. His shoulders burned. His arms trembled. He was pulling with everything he had, using muscle groups he did not normally engage, and the spring was barely moving. He glanced at the card. Required force 200 pounds, 90 kilograms. That was more than his body weight. You could not just pull. You had to use leverage, momentum, perfect technique. Morrison tried a third time, throwing his entire body into the motion. The spring compressed further, maybe 2 inches total now. But he could feel his grip slipping, feel his muscles reaching their limit. And then his right hand slipped off the handle. The spring released with shocking violence. The spigot slammed forward, and because Morrison was still partially leaning over the weapon, the butt plate caught him square in the right shoulder with the force of a prize fighter's punch. Pain exploded through his collarbone. Morrison staggered backward, nearly fell, caught himself on a bench. His vision blurred. His shoulder screamed. For a terrifying moment, he thought maybe he had broken something. Mackenzie watched without moving to help. Let Morrison suffer through those first few seconds of pain assessment, checking to see if he was truly injured or just hurt. There was a difference, and soldiers needed to learn to distinguish between them. That, Mackenzie said calmly, is why we call it the PIAT. Officially, it stands for Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. But the lads have another interpretation. Pain in the ass tube. And what you just experienced is why half of all PIAT trainees wash out in the first week. Morrison straightened slowly, cradling his shoulder. The pain was intense, but already beginning to subside from acute agony to deep throbbing. Not broken then, just badly bruised. He would have a spectacular contusion by tomorrow. Corporal Morrison, Mackenzie continued, you have just learned the first and most important lesson about the PIAT. This weapon does not care about your mechanical aptitude. It does not care about your engineering knowledge. It does not care if you can disassemble and rebuild a truck engine blindfolded. The PIAT requires something that cannot be taught or trained. It requires raw physical capability combined with absolute mental determination to deliberately hurt yourself for the privilege of hurting the enemy. He picked up the PIAT Morrison had been struggling with, positioned it expertly, and cocked it in one smooth motion that took perhaps 3 seconds. The spring compressed fully. The weapon was ready to fire. 6 weeks of training ahead of you, gentlemen. 6 weeks to transform your bodies and minds into something capable of wielding this weapon effectively. Some of you will succeed, most will not. And those who fail will return to your regular units with nothing on your record except a note that you were unsuitable for specialized weapons training. Mackenzie set the cocked PIAT down gently. Fall out. Report to the medical tent for initial evaluation. Training begins at 0500 tomorrow. Dismissed. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and canvas and something else Morrison could not quite identify. Death maybe, or just the lingering presence of too many wounded men passing through. A corporal directed him to wait on a bench while the medical officer finished with another trainee who had apparently pulled a back muscle attempting to lift a PIAT over his head for some reason. Morrison sat still, cradling his shoulder, and became aware of someone else waiting nearby. A small man, 5'6" at most, maybe 140 pounds. Asian features. American uniform with California unit patches. He was reading a training manual and taking notes in neat, precise handwriting. First time with the PIAT, the man asked without looking up from his notes. That obvious. Everyone has the same expression after the first attempt. like they just got punched by an invisible opponent and cannot figure out how to punch back. He set down the manual, extended his hand. Private Billy Chen, Los Angeles. Well, Chinatown specifically, but Americans always want to know which state, so I lead with the city. Morrison shook the offered hand, noting the grip was firm despite Chen's slight build. Jack Morrison, Dearborn, Michigan. The Auto City, you work at Ford. Before the war, yeah, engine assembly. Chen nodded thoughtfully. That explains why they selected you. Engineers think differently. McKinsey is testing to see if we can translate mechanical understanding into physical execution. Most people cannot make that leap. They know how the PIAT works in theory, but cannot force their bodies to do what their minds understand is necessary. You seem pretty analytical about it. Caltech 2 years before I enlisted. Mechanical engineering major. Got my draft notice before I could finish. Chen's expression was neutral, but Morrison detected an undercurrent of regret. Turns out the Army does not care much about college degrees. They care if you can follow orders and not get killed. A voice from the entrance to the medical tent interrupted them. Chen Morrison, you are up. The medical officer was a woman, which surprised Morrison more than it should have. He had seen female nurses, of course, but this was clearly an officer, not an enlisted nurse. Late 20s, perhaps. Green eyes that had seen too much for someone that young. Dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Corporal's insignia. Name tag read Reynolds. Corporal Sarah Reynolds, she introduced herself briskly, combat medic attached to this training unit to handle the inevitable injuries you people will inflict upon yourselves. Morrison, you first. I saw what happened. Let me check that shoulder. Her hands were efficient and impersonal, probing the joint with practiced expertise. Morrison winced but tried not to show how much it hurt. Failed, judging by her expression. Separated shoulder, she diagnosed. Grade 1, possibly grade 2. You are lucky. I have had trainees come through here with dislocated collarbones. One poor bastard from Toronto fractured his clavicle on his first shot. She began wrapping his shoulder with practiced efficiency. The PIAT does not care how tough you think you are. It will humble you. It will bruise you. And if you are stupid or unlucky, it will break you. Will I be able to continue training? Morrison asked. Reynolds paused, met his eyes directly. Should you? That depends on whether you have the sense God gave a mule. This injury needs rest, ice, at least 48 hours of no physical strain. But you are military, and military means you will ignore medical advice and push through because that is what soldiers do. She finished the wrap, stepped back. So let me be very clear. You have one shoulder separation. If you re-injure it before it heals, you risk permanent damage, chronic instability, pain for the rest of your life. Is mastering a British spring gun worth that? Morrison thought about the court-martial, about Major Blackwood's offer, about the fact that failure here meant returning to face consequences he did not want to contemplate. Yes, ma'am, it is worth it. Reynolds sighed. Of course it is. Chen, you are up. Let me see what damage you have managed to inflict on yourself. While Reynolds examined Chen, who apparently had strained both wrists, attempting to cock a PIAT with improper hand positioning, Morrison studied the woman more carefully. There was a hardness to her that went beyond professional competence. The way she moved suggested someone who had seen combat, not just treated its aftermath. The ribbon on her chest was from North Africa. She had been in theater when things were going badly for the Allies, when every day brought more wounded than the medical corps could handle. You are staring, Reynolds said without looking at him. I assume because you are surprised to see a woman in a combat zone. No, ma'am, I was trying to figure out what campaign that ribbon is from. She glanced at him, expression softening slightly. Tunisia, Kasserine Pass. Lost my entire unit except for 6 men. Spent 3 days treating wounded in a bombed-out farmhouse while Germans and Americans fought around us. She turned back to Chen. Both wrists sprained, same advice as Morrison. Rest ice, ignore it, and re-injure yourself because soldiers are universally stupid about their own health. Chen smiled despite the obvious pain. Thank you for your confidence in our intelligence, ma'am. Confidence has nothing to do with it. Experience. Every soldier I have ever treated thinks they are tougher than their injuries. Most are wrong. Again, Mom. And she made notes on a clipboard. Both of you are dismissed. Try not to break anything important before tomorrow's training session. Outside the medical tent, Morrison and Chen walked slowly back toward the barracks. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink that seemed at odds with the harsh reality of military training. "She is right, you know," Chen said quietly, "about soldiers being stupid. We are trained to push through pain and ignore injuries, keep fighting until we drop. It keeps us alive in combat, but in training it just creates permanent damage for no good reason." "You planning to follow her advice? Rest and ice." Chen laughed softly. "Not a chance. Mackenzie will eat us alive if we show weakness. Better to power through and hope our bodies adapt faster than they break down." He paused. "You thinking the same thing?" "Yeah," Morrison admitted. "I did not come all this way to wash out because of a bruised shoulder. That is not a bruised shoulder. You shoulder. That is a grade 1 separation. There is a difference. Engineering major, huh? You always this precise about medical terminology?" "My girlfriend is a nursing student. Was a nursing student." Chen's expression flickered with something Morrison could not quite read. "We broke up before I shipped out. She said she could not handle the thought of me dying overseas. Easier to end it while we both had a chance to move on." Morrison did not know what to say to that. Relationship advice had never been his strength even before the war. They reached the barracks, a long wooden building with bunks for 30 men. Most of the other American trainees were already there comparing injuries like badges of honor. Morrison found an empty bunk, dropped his duffel bag, and lay down carefully to avoid jarring his shoulder. That night, sleep would not come. The pain was manageable but persistent, and every time Morrison shifted position, he was reminded of his failure with the PIAT. The spring had beaten him. Pure mechanical advantage over human muscle. There had to be a better technique, a smarter way to approach the problem. At 2 in the morning, Morrison gave up on sleep. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake the other trainees, and slipped out of the barracks. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead in a way they never were in Detroit with its factories and smoke. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The training building was locked, but Morrison had not spent 5 years working at Ford without learning how to bypass simple locks. 30 seconds with a piece of wire from his pocket, and he was inside. The PIAT stood in their rack like silent judges. Morrison approached one, studied it in the dim light filtering through windows. The spring mechanism was visible through gaps in the housing. Large coil spring, maybe 6 inches in diameter, compressed length, probably 18 inches when cocked. The force required to compress it evenly across that distance would be enormous. But force was just physics. Leverage could multiply force. Angle could change the vector of application. There had to be a more efficient method than the brute strength approach the manual described. Morrison pulled out a small notebook he always carried, began sketching. Force diagrams, angle calculations, the relationship between body positioning and mechanical advantage. He was so absorbed in the problem that he did not hear anyone enter until a voice behind him said, "Could not sleep either." Morrison spun, heart racing. Billy Chen stood in the doorway, also dressed, also apparently unable to rest. "I picked the lock," Morrison said quickly. "You can report me if you want. For breaking into a training building to study the weapon we are supposed to be learning. That would be spectacularly stupid, even by military standards." Chen approached, looked at Morrison's notebook. "Force distribution analysis. You are trying to optimize the cocking technique. The manual method requires more strength than most soldiers possess. There has to be a better way. A smarter application of leverage. Show me what you are thinking." For the next 2 hours, Morrison and Chen worked through the problem. They could not actually cock a PIAT without alerting the entire base to their unauthorized presence, but they could analyze the mechanics, calculate the angles, theorize about optimal body positioning. Chen's engineering background proved invaluable. He understood the mathematical relationships Morrison was sketching could translate intuitive mechanical understanding into precise calculations. Together, they developed a hypothesis. If you angled the PIAT 15 degrees from vertical and used a pushing motion with your legs while pulling with your arms, you could effectively use your body weight to assist the cocking action. The ground would provide the resistance needed to counteract the spring's force. "We need to test it," Morrison said, At 2 in the morning in a locked building without authorization, Morrison, I am starting to understand why you got court-martialed. You have a better idea. Chen considered this. No, I do not. Let us see if your theory holds up. They chose the PIAT with the smoothest action, positioned it at the calculated 15-degree angle, with the butt plate on the floor, and Morrison gripped the cocking handle. Deep breath. This was either going to work beautifully or re-injure his shoulder spectacularly. He pulled while simultaneously pushing down and forward, with his legs using his body weight to drive against the floor's resistance. The spring began to compress, smoothly, steadily. Morrison felt the load distributing across his entire body instead of concentrating in his arms and shoulders. The spring compressed further, 6 inches, 12 inches. Morrison's muscles burned, but the pain was manageable, spread out nothing like the focused agony of the vertical method. Click. The spring locked into cock position. Morrison had just compressed 200 pounds of spring force using technique and leverage instead of raw strength. His shoulder throbbed, but had not given out. Success. Holy shit, Chen breathed. That actually works. Physics, Morrison said, carefully releasing the cocking handle. Ford did not teach me to fight. They taught me to think in systems, and this weapon is just another system that needs optimization. Mackenzie is going to love this, or hate it. Hard to predict which. Let us find out tomorrow. They carefully returned everything to its original position, locked the door behind them, and returned to the barracks. This time Morrison slept, not well and not long, but he slept with the satisfaction of having solved a problem that had defeated him earlier. Morning formation came brutally early. 500 meant pre-dawn darkness, cold that bit through layers of clothing, and Sergeant Mackenzie looking fresh and alert, while the trainees looked like walking corpses. Today, Mackenzie announced, you will learn the proper cockings procedure. Those of you who failed yesterday will have another opportunity. Those who failed today will be reassessed for suitability. His gaze swept across the assembled Americans, Morrison Chen front and center. They stepped forward. Morrison's stomach tightened. Had someone seen them in the training building? Were they about to be disciplined for unauthorized access? Morrison, you injured yourself yesterday through improper technique. Are you capable of attempting again? Yes, Sergeant. Then demonstrate. Show these men what not to do. Morrison approached the PIAT Mackenzie indicated, but instead of following the manual method that had failed him yesterday, he positioned the weapon at a 15-degree angle, butt plate on the ground, proper grip on the cocking handle. Mackenzie's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing certainty. Morrison pulled and pushed simultaneously using the technique he and Chen had developed in the early morning hours. The spring compressed smoothly, steadily. 6 seconds of sustained effort, and the weapon was cocked. He released the handle, stepped back. The PIAT stood ready, spring-loaded, no injury, no drama. Just efficient, mechanical action. The training yard was completely silent. Every trainee, every observer, every officer watched with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. Morrison had just cocked a PIAT smoothly and efficiently, despite having injured himself doing the exact same task 24 hours earlier. Mackenzie's jaw was clenched. His eyes were hard. For a long moment, Morrison genuinely could not tell if the sergeant was about to commend him or court-martial him for a second time. Then Mackenzie said, again. Morrison repeated the process. Same angle, same technique, same result. Perfect cocking, action. Minimal strain, no injury. 5 shots. 5 successful cocking procedures. 0 failures. Mackenzie finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. Corporal Morrison, that technique is not in the manual. No, Sergeant, it is not. Did you develop it yourself? Private Chen and I analyzed the force distribution requirements and calculated an optimal approach, Sergeant. When? Last night, Sergeant, we could not sleep. Mackenzie stared at them both for what felt like an eternity. Then, incredibly, the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. Fall in formation. All of you will now learn Corporal Morrison's technique. Because in this man's army, we care about 2 things, killing Germans and keeping you alive to kill more Germans. Pride is not on that list. If an American mechanic figures out a better method, then British engineers will use that method. Understood. Yes, Sergeant. The training continued, but something had shifted. Morrison had proven himself not through compliance but through innovation, through seeing a problem and solving it, even if that meant breaking into buildings at 2 in the morning and ignoring the approved manual procedures. He was still a troublemaker, still someone who questioned authority and modified systems without permission. But now he was Mackenzie's troublemaker, and that made all the difference. 3 days later, Major Blackwood returned with classified documents that would change everything. German intelligence reports, Wehrmacht tactical bulletins, captured communications that revealed something shocking. The enemy was afraid, genuinely deeply afraid, not of superior technology or overwhelming force, but of a crude spring-loaded tube that killed without being seen. The Germans had a name for it now, Geisterwaffe, ghost weapon, and the soldiers who wielded it were becoming ghosts themselves, invisible, lethal, impossible to locate or predict. Morrison listened to Blackwood read the translated German reports and felt something shift in his understanding. This was not just about mechanical efficiency anymore. This was about psychological warfare, about transforming the invisible into a weapon more powerful than any explosive. That evening, Morrison sat alone in the mess hall with a bottle of Coca-Cola, that distinctly American drink that tasted like home. He wrote a letter to his mother on cheap military stationery. Dear Ma, cannot tell you where I am or what I am training for, but I can tell you this: I am working with a weapon that does not look like much. It is crude heavy and it hurts to use, but it works because it is simple and honest, like the engines Dad and I used to build. The Germans build fancy tanks with over-engineered parts. We are fighting back with American thinking. If it works, it is right. If it wins, it is good. Do not worry about me. I am learning important things. Love, Jack. What Morrison did not write was the rest of the truth, that in 3 weeks he would be in Italy, that within 2 months there would be a price on his head, that he was about to learn the difference between being good at something and being feared for it. The ghost was taking shape. The legend was beginning. And Jack Morrison, troublemaker and engineer, was about to discover that sometimes the most devastating weapons are the ones nobody sees coming. The training continued. The spring continued to teach him respect. And somewhere across the Atlantic, German tank crews were learning to fear the sound of silence. July 1944, Naples, Italy. The smell hit Morrison first before he even stepped off the transport ship. Not the salt air of the Mediterranean, though that was there too, but smoke, cordite and burning wood, and something worse, something organic that he did not want to identify, but his mind identified anyway. Death, old death and new death, and the promise of more death to come. The city was a ruin. Allied bombing had torn apart the infrastructure. German demolitions before their retreat had finished what the bomb started. And now thousands of soldiers moved through the wreckage like ants rebuilding a destroyed colony, trying to impose order on chaos that resisted all attempts at organization. Morrison and Chen stood on the dock with their gear, watching Italian civilians pick through rubble, searching for anything salvageable. Children no older than 8 or 9 worked alongside adults, faces hard with premature knowledge of hunger and loss. War aged everyone it touched, but it aged children fastest of all. "Welcome to the real war," a voice said behind them, Canadian accent, rough with exhaustion and cigarette smoke. Morrison turned. The soldier who had spoken was lean to the point of gauntness, 24 years old, but looking 40 in the eyes. Uniform faded from sun and wear. 3 ribbons on his chest, one of them the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, dark hair cut short, hands steady despite the cigarette they held. This was someone who had seen things done, things survived, things that left permanent marks invisible to casual observation. "Private First Class James O'Brien," the man introduced himself. "Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, you must be the American observers Bull Mackenzie trained. Word is one of you figured out how to cock a PIAT without dislocating your shoulder. That true?" "Morrison, and yeah, I worked out a better technique." "Good, you will need it." O'Brien took a long drag on his cigarette. Something about the way he smoked suggested it was not just habit but necessity, a way to calm nerves that never truly calmed. 7 tanks, that is my count, 7 confirmed kills with the PIAT. You know what that means? Morrison shook his head. Means I have killed approximately 28 men. Tank cruiser 4, sometimes 5. Panther carries 5. Tiger carries 5. Panzer IV carries 5. I remember every face I saw before they burned. O'Brien's expression did not change, but something in his eyes went very far away. They train you on targets, metal silhouettes, but nobody trains you for the faces, for the screaming, for the smell of cooking meat that you know is human, but your mind keeps trying to pretend is something else. Chen shifted uncomfortably. Morrison said nothing, sensing that O'Brien was not looking for a response, just stating facts that needed to be acknowledged before they could move forward. "Come on," O'Brien said, dropping his cigarette and crushing it under his boot. "I will show you what Bull Mackenzie did not teach you. The part they cannot teach because you have to live it to understand it." They followed O'Brien through the ruined city, past checkpoints and supply depots and field hospitals, where the wounded lay in rows waiting for transport or surgery, or morphine, or death. Morrison saw men missing limbs, men with faces wrapped in bandages, men who stared at nothing with eyes that had stopped registering the external world. This was not training. This was the place training tried to prepare you for, and inevitably failed because no simulation could capture the totality of war, the noise, the smell, the constant low-level fear that settled into your bones and never quite left. O'Brien led them to a bombed-out olive grove overlooking a valley. Italian countryside, beautiful in the golden afternoon light, completely at odds with the Sherman tank hull rusting at the bottom of the slope. American tank taken out by German anti-tank gun months ago. Crew probably buried somewhere nearby. "See that burned Panzer IV?" O'Brien pointed to a blackened hulk 400 meters downrange. "That was my third kill, May 17th. I was hiding in that stone wall 40 meters away. Side shot. One round. Clean kill." He lit another cigarette, and Morrison noticed his hands were not quite as steady now. Crew got out. Two of them were on fire. One was a kid, could not have been more than 19. Blonde hair, blue eyes, looked like every propaganda poster of the master race. He looked right at me before he stopped screaming. Made eye contact. I think he was trying to ask why. Why did this happen? Why was he burning alive in an Italian field so far from home? O'Brien took a long drag. "Bull Mackenzie probably trained you on technique and tactics. That is important. But here is what is more important. The PIAT makes you invisible to the enemy, but you cannot become invisible to yourself. You have to carry every shot, every face, every scream. If you let yourself forget that you are killing human beings, you become something that is not quite human anymore." "How do you do it?" Morrison asked quietly. "How do you keep fighting while carrying that?" "You remember why. Germans invaded France, bombed Britain, murdered millions. If I do not kill that tank kills 20 of my brothers. It is not vengeance, it is math. Dark math, but math." O'Brien looked directly at Morrison. "And the second thing, you are American, right? You believe in freedom, fair play, the rights of regular people." "Yes." "Then remember, every German tanker you stop is one less killing machine rolling through a French village or an Italian town. The PIAT is not just a weapon. It is how ordinary men like us stop mechanical tyranny. That is worth the nightmares, has to be. Because if it is not worth it, then we are just murderers in uniforms." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. Someone else's war happening in real time. "Tomorrow," O'Brien said, "you will go on your first mission. Reconnaissance patrol, 2 Panzer IVs defending the approach to a village we need to clear. You and I will be the PIAT team. Chen goes as spotter and ammunition carrier. This is going to be different from training. Training, you miss the target and Bull Mackenzie yells at you. Here you miss the target and Germans kill everyone in your unit while you watch." He dropped his second cigarette, crushed it. "Get some sleep tonight if you can. Tomorrow you stop being students and become killers. The transition is harder than people think." That night, Morrison lay on his cot in a tent shared with 8 other soldiers and tried to sleep. Could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that burned-out Panzer IV, saw the faces O'Brien described, blonde hair and blue eyes, and questions that could never be answered. He thought about his father, about American values, about the difference between killing because you want to and killing because the alternative is worse. Somewhere in that distinction lay the line between soldier and murderer, but Morrison was not entirely sure where that line was anymore. At 0300, Chen whispered from the adjacent cot, "You awake?" "Yeah. Me too, thinking about tomorrow." And, and I am terrified not of dying, of failing, of freezing when it matters, of letting everyone down because I was too scared to function. Morrison had no comfort to offer because he felt exactly the same way. So he said the only honest thing he could think of. Then we be terrified together. And maybe that is enough. July 28th, dawn came too quickly. Morrison stood with O'Brien and Chen in the back of a truck rolling toward the front line, checking his gear for the 5th time. PIAT loaded. 3 spare bombs in Chen's pack. Grenades. Rifle. Everything a soldier needs to kill or be killed. The village they were approaching had no name Morrison could pronounce. Just another Italian settlement caught between armies, its people long since evacuated or dead. Intelligence said 2 Panzer IVs defending the main approach. German infantry dug in around them. Canadian forces needed that road clear for the next phase of the offensive. Morrison's job, make tanks go away, silently, efficiently, without revealing his position. They dismounted 2 kilometers from the target, moved forward on foot through a destroyed vineyard. Grapevines torn apart by artillery, ground cratered and muddy, the sweet smell of rotting grapes mixing with the ever-present stink of decay that permeated every battlefield. O'Brien moved like a ghost, making no sound, disturbing nothing. Morrison tried to match that silence and failed. His boots crunched on debris. His breathing seemed loud in his own ears. Chen behind him carried the ammunition with admirable quiet, but Morrison could sense his tension in every movement. 200 meters to their prepared position. A stone wall overlooking the road partially collapsed but providing excellent concealment. They reached it without incident, settled in, and O'Brien studied the target area through binoculars. 2 Panzer IVs, 30 tons each, both idling ready to move, turrets traversing slowly. They are hunting for us, but do not know our position yet. He handed the binoculars to Morrison. See the second one, that is yours. Wait for my shot. When the first tank explodes, the second will panic and turn his turret toward me. 3-second window. You hit his side armor during that window. Miss, and we both die. Understand? Morrison's mouth was dry, heart hammering. This was real. This was happening. In the next few minutes, he would either kill men or watch his friends die trying. I understand. O'Brien loaded his PIAT with movements so practiced they seemed almost casual. Morrison did the same, handshaking slightly, but manageable. The weapon felt different now. Not just 35 pounds of steel and spring, but responsibility, consequence, the weight of decisions that could not be unmade. They waited. Patience was part of the weapon, O'Brien had said. You do not rush the shot. You wait for the perfect moment when physics and positioning and enemy inattention all align. 10 minutes passed. 20. Morrison's legs cramped. His shoulder ached from holding position. Sweat ran down his back despite the morning cool. And still they waited. Then the lead Panzer's turret rotated away, scanning the opposite direction. 3 seconds of exposed side armor. O'Brien whispered, now. Thud. The sound was exactly as Mackenzie had described. Not an explosion, not a whoosh, just a heavy metallic impact as the bomb left the spigot and arced downrange. Morrison watched it fly, saw it descend, saw it strike the Panzer IV's side armor dead center. The shaped charge detonated, penetrated, and inside that steel box, hell erupted. The tank's internal ammunition exploded. Hatches blew open. Flames vomited from every opening. And men scrambled out, some of them on fire, screaming in German, burning alive, while Morrison watched through gaps in the stone wall. The 2nd Panzer's turret swung violently toward O'Brien's position exactly as predicted. 3-second window, side armor exposed. Morrison rose to firing position, PIAT against his shoulder. The tank was 40 meters away, close enough to see details. Close enough to see the commander standing in the turret hatch, binoculars to his eyes, trying to locate the threat. Morrison aimed, not at the tank, at the man inside it, at 4 or 5 human beings who had families and lives and futures that were about to end because Jack Morrison from Dearborn, Michigan, squeezed a trigger. American value number 1, his father's voice echoed. When you see what needs doing, you do it right the first time. Morrison squeezed the trigger. Thud. The bomb flew in its arc. 40 meters. 2 seconds of flight time. Morrison watched it descend, watched it strike, watched it punch through armor that was supposed to be protection, but became a tomb instead. The 2nd Panzer IV exploded from within. Catastrophic kill, ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that tore the vehicle apart from the inside. The commander in the turret was thrown clear by the blast, his body a rag doll tumbling through smoke. Morrison stared. He had just killed 4 men. Maybe 5. Human beings who had been alive and thinking and breathing 60 seconds ago and now were burning meat inside a metal coffin. His stomach lurched. He turned away from the wall and vomited. Could not help it. Could not stop it. Everything he had eaten that morning came back up in violent convulsions that left him shaking and gasping. O'Brien's hand gripped his shoulder. Not gently, hard, grounding. First kill is always hardest. Acknowledge it. Do not suppress it. Feel it. Then we move because German infantry saw where those bombs landed and they are coming for us right now. Machine gun fire ripped overhead. MG-42, the German buzzsaw, 1,200 rounds per minute, turning the air above the stone wall into a death zone. Morrison forced himself to function, grabbed his gear, followed O'Brien in a crouching run back toward friendly lines. Behind them, both tanks burned. Morrison's first kills, clean, efficient, exactly as training had taught. But training had not taught him about the faces, about the specific way human bodies moved when they were on fire, about the sound of men screaming in a language he did not understand but comprehended perfectly anyway. That night back at camp, Morrison could not sleep, could not eat, sat outside his tent staring at nothing while his mind replayed every second of the engagement over and over and over. Chen found him there at midnight. "Does it get easier?" Morrison asked. Chen was quiet for a long time. Then O'Brien says, "Yes, but I think what gets easier is pretending it does not hurt." The war continued. The kills accumulated. August through September 1944, Morrison's count grew with mechanical efficiency. Tank 3, Tank 4, Tanks 5 and 6 in a single engagement 30 seconds apart. Each one a small masterpiece of tactical execution. Each one carrying faces that joined the growing crowd in his nightmares. The Germans started noticing patterns. Wehrmacht tactical reports mentioned the Amerikanischer Geisterjäger, the American ghost hunter. Allied intelligence intercepted radio chatter. Avoid areas with no visual cues. The Americans have developed invisible anti-tank capability. Morrison's reputation spread through Canadian divisions. Soldiers wanted to see the weapon. Officers wanted to learn his techniques. He was becoming famous, becoming legend, and with every kill becoming less recognizable to himself. Sarah Reynolds noticed. The combat medic with green eyes and too much experience pulled him aside one evening in late September. "You are not eating, not sleeping properly. Jack, you are breaking." "I am fine." "You are not fine. I have seen this before." The 1,000-yard stare, the emotional numbing. Post-traumatic stress does not wait until after the war to manifest. It starts now while you are still in it. Morrison wanted to argue, wanted to insist he could handle it. But the truth was he could not remember the last time he had felt genuinely happy, or sad, or anything except a kind of gray functional numbness that let him kill efficiently without thinking too hard about what killing meant. "What do I do?" he asked finally. "You remember you are human. You keep people close who remind you that you are more than just a weapon." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Billy Chen watches your back. O'Brien taught you how to survive. I patch you up when this weapon breaks your body. We are your tether to humanity. Do not cut that tether." 300 kilometers north in a Wehrmacht command post, Hauptmann Erich Steiner studied combat reports with the focused intensity of someone solving a complex engineering problem. 32 years old, Stuttgart native, mechanical engineer before the war, now commanding a panzer support unit with a single mission: neutralize the ghost weapon. Steiner had lost 12 tanks in 4 months, not to superior American armor, not to air support, but to an infantry weapon that his own engineers insisted should not be effective against modern armor. Spring-powered, primitive mechanism, no sophisticated propulsion system, and yet it worked brilliantly. Worked so well that German tank crews were becoming paranoid, flinching at every shadow, afraid to advance because any bush or rubble pile or window might hide death that gave no warning. Steiner laid out maps, trajectory analyses, engagement reports, saw the pattern, preference for side armor attacks, engagement range 30 to 50 meters. always from concealed positions, buildings or terrain features that provided both cover and clear line of sight. "This is not random," he said to his adjutant. "This is one man or a small team. Look at the consistency, the methodology. This is an engineer's mind applied to warfare." He tapped a decoded American communique. "Corporal Jack Morrison, United States Army, attached to 1st Canadian Infantry Division, former automotive mechanic. That explains everything." "So we kill him," his adjutant suggested. "No," Steiner said slowly. "First we study him, then we counter him. He thinks like an engineer, so do I. This will be intellectually satisfying." Steiner began implementing countermeasures. Positioned observers to triangulate bomb trajectories, place snipers in expected ambush zones, develop protocols for rapid response to PIAT attacks. The cat and mouse game escalated. Morrison fired and moved before German snipers could target him, changed his patterns, varied his engagement ranges, adapted faster than the Germans could counter-adapt. But Steiner was learning, patient, methodical, building a profile of his opponent through accumulated data. October 3, 1944. The trap was elegantly simple. A Tiger I tank apparently disabled sitting in a town square like a gift. Morrison's tactical instinct screamed warning before he even saw the setup clearly. "Too obvious?" Chen muttered, scanning surrounding buildings through binoculars. "Why would they leave a Tiger unguarded?" Morrison studied the terrain, caught the faint glint of metal in a third-story window. MG-42 barrel poorly concealed. Second building, same glint. Third building, same pattern. "It is bait. They are learning to hunt hunters." But orders were orders. Command wanted that Tiger verified, destroyed. Morrison approached from an unexpected angle through a collapsed church using rubble for concealment. 50 meters from the Tiger, he heard it. The faint rumble of an idling engine. Trap, fall back. German machine guns opened fire from 3 positions simultaneously. The ambush was sophisticated, well-planned. Someone smart was hunting them now. Someone who understood tactics and patience and how to predict enemy behavior. They escaped with minor injuries and massive damage to Morrison's confidence. He was no longer invisible. The Germans had adapted, found a way to counter the ghost weapon through simple observation and intelligent analysis. That night, O'Brien visited Morrison's tent. The Irish-Canadian looked older than usual, exhaustion etched deep. "I am being evacuated," O'Brien said without preamble. "Shrapnel from yesterday. Nothing fatal, but enough to send me back to England. Doctors say I will walk again, but fighting is done." Morrison felt something crack inside. O'Brien had been his mentor, his example of how to survive war while remaining human. "What do I do without you?" O'Brien pulled out a Zippo lighter, well-worn, engraved with Vancouver Fire Department, 1939, handed it to Morrison. "My dad gave me this when I joined up. Said fire can destroy or it can forge. The PIAT is your forge. What you become from using it, that is up to you." They shook hands. Morrison never saw O'Brien again until many years later, when the war was memory and the ghosts had faded to manageable shadows. But he kept the Zippo, carried it through every mission. A reminder that fire could forge as well as destroy. December 1944, Morrison had 23 confirmed kills, a Medal of Honor nomination pending, a price on his head, 500 Reichsmarks, and a message from Hauptmann Erich Steiner delivered through Red Cross channels. The message was formal, respectful, and completely insane. "Dear Corporal Morrison, I am Hauptmann Erich Steiner's 2nd Panzer Support Battalion. You have destroyed 7 of my tanks. I have studied your methods. You are an artist of destruction. I propose a meeting. One soldier to another. You may bring your PIAT, I will bring mine. We will settle this as craftsmen, not as anonymous killers. With professional respect, Hauptmann Erich Steiner." Morrison read it 3 times. Sarah Reynolds called it a trap. Command ordered him to refuse. Billy Chen thought Steiner was genuinely sincere in some twisted military way. Morrison thought about O'Brien, about the Zippo, about his father's words. "When you see what needs doing, you do it." "I am going," he told Major Blackwood. "You are refusing a direct order. I have killed 21 men in 4 months. Every face burns in my head. If I can end this, truly end it, I have to try it." Blackwood was silent. Then, "You do not go alone. Reynolds goes as medical support. Chen as observer. And if it is a trap, we have extraction ready. The meeting was set for dawn in a burned wheat field between lines. Morrison walked out carrying his PIAT heart, hammering, wondering if he was walking toward the honorable resolution or sniper fire. Hauptmann Erich Steiner emerged from the German side, tall, thin Wehrmacht field gray, also carrying a PIAT. They met in the center, 50 meters from either line. Corporal Morrison, Captain Steiner. They studied each other. Morrison saw what he had not expected: kindness in the German's eyes, weariness, intelligence. "You are younger than I imagined," Steiner said in perfect English. "You are not what I expected either." "What did you expect, a monster?" "Maybe." Steiner smiled sadly. "I am an engineer from Stuttgart. I designed water pumps. Then Hitler needed tank commanders. Now I kill for a cause I stopped believing in 2 years ago. And you, mechanic from Detroit, fix cars, now I break tanks." This weapon, Steiner hefted the PIAT, is brilliant in its simplicity. Very American thinking, practical over elegant. They talked for 30 minutes about engineering, about war, about the difference between soldiers and the causes they serve. And gradually Morrison understood this man was not his enemy. This man was his mirror. Another engineer forced to become a killer, trying to maintain humanity while doing inhuman things. "Shall we settle this?" Steiner finally asked. "You and I, the craftsmen." They raised their PIATs, fired simultaneously, both deliberately missed, bombs striking ground meters away from targets. Steiner lowered his weapon. "Perhaps we are both bad shots, or perhaps we are both tired of killing men who never wronged us personally." They shook hands, turned and walked back to their respective lines. The war continued, but something had changed. Germany surrendered May 8, 1945. Morrison returned to Dearborn with medals he did not want and nightmares that never fully stopped. Married Sarah Reynolds in 1947, had 3 children, opened in Morrison Auto Repair, lived a normal life haunted by abnormal memories. In 1963, a letter arrived from Stuttgart. Erich Steiner had survived, spent 3 years in Soviet captivity, returned to designing water pumps. The letter thanked Morrison for missing, for choosing humanity over efficiency, for proving that American strength was not just firepower, but the capacity to see enemies as human even while defeating them. Morrison kept that letter framed in his shop until he died in 1994, age 76. At his funeral, Billy Chen gave the eulogy. Jack Morrison was called the ghost, but he was never a ghost. He was profoundly, stubbornly human. He wielded a weapon that killed invisibly, but refused to become invisible himself. The lesson is not about weapons or tactics. It is about American values. You can be forced to fight, but you choose how you fight. You can kill when necessary, but you do not have to become a killer. Jack showed us that real strength is remaining visible, remaining human, even when war gives you permission to disappear. Today, a PIAT sits in the Smithsonian labeled Innovative Weapons of World War II. But the real weapon was never the steel and spring. It was the values of men like Jack Morrison. American practicality, stubbornness, creativity, and the belief that humanity matters more than efficiency. The PIAT was silent, but the men who carried it spoke volumes about who Americans really are. Real strength is not being invisible. Real strength is remaining visible, remaining human, even when darkness offers easier paths. This was the story of Jack Morrison, the American ghost, whose light continued to shine through the darkness he fought against. May we remember. May we honor. May we never forget what the greatest generation understood about strength and humanity and the price of remaining yourself in a world trying to make you into something less.